Chemical weapons stand out as particularly horrific instruments of war. Their use was outlawed by international agreement after their appalling effects were witnessed in the trenches of the First World War. These weapons can kill and maim indiscriminately, striking at civilians as well as soldiers, and they inflict prolonged and agonizing deaths. The rest of the world quickly agreed that such weapons had no place in warfare. They were too cruel to be used, even against the enemy's armed forces. It was recognized that if the use of chemical weapons was not banned, the world might one day face a form of warfare in which entire cities could be wiped out by a single attack. The use of chemical weapons violates basic principles of humanity and the laws of war. The development, production, stockpiling, and use of chemical weapons are all prohibited under international law. This comprehensive ban reflects the global consensus on the need to protect humanity from the horrors of chemical warfare. There are a number of reasons why chemical weapons are considered to be so abhorrent. First, they are indiscriminate in their effects. Unlike conventional weapons, which can be targeted at military objectives, chemical weapons can spread over a wide area, harming or killing anyone in their path. This makes it very difficult to use chemical weapons without causing significant civilian casualties, which is a clear violation of international law. The international community has long recognized the need to regulate warfare. The laws of war, also known as international humanitarian law, are a set of rules that seek to limit the barbarity of war. These laws are contained in treaties, customary international law, and other sources. They apply to both international and internal armed conflicts. The laws of war are based on two fundamental principles: distinction and proportionality. The principle of distinction requires parties to a conflict to distinguish between combatants and civilians. Attacks may only be directed against combatants and military objectives. Civilians and civilian objects must be spared. The principle of proportionality prohibits attacks that cause excessive incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, or damage to civilian objects. When planning and conducting attacks, parties to a conflict must take into account the likely civilian harm and ensure that the military advantage gained by an attack outweighs the expected civilian harm. The laws of war also contain a number of specific prohibitions, such as the use of certain weapons. Chemical weapons are prohibited because they are inherently indiscriminate and because they cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering. The horrors of chemical warfare were first witnessed on a large scale during the First World War. On April 22, 1915, German forces released chlorine gas on French troops at the Battle of Ypres in Belgium. The attack killed over 5,000 soldiers and injured thousands more. The use of chemical weapons in World War I shocked the world. The weapons were seen as a barbaric and inhumane way to fight a war. The use of chemical weapons also led to a number of long-term health problems for soldiers who were exposed to them. The use of chemical weapons in World War I led to the development of the first international treaty to ban their use. The 1925 Geneva Protocol prohibited the use of asphyxiating, poisonous or other gases, and of bacteriological methods of warfare. The Geneva Protocol was a landmark agreement, but it had a number of weaknesses. First, it did not ban the development, production, or stockpiling of chemical weapons. Second, it did not establish any mechanism for verifying compliance with the treaty. Despite the horrors of World War I, the 1925 Geneva Protocol, while a step in the right direction, was not a complete solution. Though it outlawed the actual use of poison gas and biological weapons in warfare, it did not prohibit nations from manufacturing and stockpiling such weapons, and many of them did. The protocol also failed to include any means of verifying that the signatory nations were actually complying with their agreement not to use these weapons. There was no international body to carry out inspections to ensure that no country was secretly producing poison gas. The result was predictable. Although no country publicly admitted to using poison gas in battle during the Second World War, it was widely believed that if the conflict had continued for much longer, both sides would have resorted to chemical warfare. Moreover, the protocol said nothing about the use of chemical weapons in conflicts that were not formally declared to be wars. This loophole allowed several countries, including Italy and Japan, to use poison gas against their enemies during this period without technically violating the agreement. Section 5. Unacceptable suffering. The use of chemical weapons raises a number of ethical concerns. These weapons cause immense suffering and can have long-term health consequences for those exposed to them. They are also indiscriminate in their effects, meaning that they can harm civilians as well as combatants. The use of chemical weapons is a violation of the principle of distinction, which requires parties to a conflict to distinguish between combatants and civilians. Chemical weapons cannot be targeted with precision and can easily spread to civilian areas. The use of chemical weapons also violates the principle of proportionality, which prohibits attacks that cause excessive incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, or damage to civilian objects. Chemical weapons are inherently indiscriminate, and their effects can be widespread and long-lasting. The ethical concerns surrounding the use of chemical weapons are reflected in the international community's condemnation of their use. The use of chemical weapons is a war crime, and those who use them can be held accountable for their actions. Section 6. Chemical warfare in the Gulf. The use of chemical weapons in the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988 is a stark reminder of the horrors of these weapons. Both sides used chemical weapons during the conflict, resulting in thousands of casualties. The attacks on Kurdish civilians in Halabja, Iraq, in 1988 were particularly horrific. The use of chemical weapons in the Iran-Iraq War led to renewed calls for a global ban on these weapons. The international community was outraged by the suffering caused by chemical weapons and determined to prevent their future use. The use of chemical weapons in the Iran-Iraq War also highlighted the weaknesses of the 1925 Geneva Protocol. The protocol did not prevent either Iran or Iraq from developing, producing, or stockpiling chemical weapons, nor did it provide any mechanism for verifying compliance with the treaty. The Iran-Iraq War demonstrated the need for a more comprehensive and effective treaty to ban chemical weapons. The Chemical Weapons Convention, or CWC, which entered into force in 1997, was the international community's response to this need. Section 7. Outlawing poison. The Chemical Weapons Convention, which entered into force in 1997, is a landmark treaty that bans the development, production, stockpiling, transfer, and use of chemical weapons. It is the most comprehensive arms control treaty ever negotiated. The CWC established the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, or OPCW, which is responsible for verifying compliance with the treaty. The OPCW has its headquarters in The Hague, Netherlands, and carries out inspections of chemical weapons facilities around the world. The CWC has been very successful in achieving its objectives. Since its entry into force, the OPCW has verified the destruction of over 99% of the world's declared chemical weapons stockpiles. The OPCW has also helped to prevent the proliferation of chemical weapons by providing assistance to states parties in implementing the treaty. The CWC is a testament to the international community's commitment to eliminating chemical weapons. It is a shining example of what can be achieved through multilateral cooperation. Section 8. A continuing struggle. Despite the successes of the CWC, the threat of chemical weapons remains. A number of countries are still believed to possess chemical weapons, and there is a risk that these weapons could fall into the hands of terrorists. The use of chemical weapons in Syria since 2013 is a stark reminder of the threat these weapons pose. The Syrian government has used chemical weapons on numerous occasions, resulting in thousands of casualties. The international community has condemned the use of chemical weapons in Syria and has taken steps to hold those responsible accountable. However, more needs to be done to prevent the use of chemical weapons in Syria and elsewhere. The international community must continue to work together to strengthen the CWC and to prevent the proliferation of chemical weapons. We must also be prepared to respond decisively to any use of chemical weapons.